We'll get started in just a second here, folks. We're still waiting for some people to join up. Can we get a class tour? It's not going to be super easy because the webcam is built into this computer here. I can try, I guess. I can swivel it, but that's the front of the class, or I guess like the entrance to the class. And here's all of the socially distanced desks. It didn't used to look like that. Sorry, I gotta rotate this around. Here's my awesome painting of, it's actually just a print of a painting, but there's an African-American artist by the name of John Hall who lives in Tampa, Florida. And a couple of years ago, I reached out to John Hall. He's done a lot of art. He does portraiture art of African Americans, mostly. And he has a painting that I have hanging in my house, actually, of like a, I guess, political philosopher of sorts, or a social philosopher, historian, named James Baldwin. James Baldwin, until recently, was kind of a forgotten figure of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And the reason that he was forgotten is because James Baldwin was a gay man. And for a lot of time, a period of time, there was a lot of stigma in America and in the African American community surrounding homosexuality. And so James Baldwin's writings kind of got glossed over for a while. However, in recent years, the last like 10 or 15 years, James Baldwin's writings have become more and more and more and more significant. And I read a lot of James Baldwin when I was in grad school. So I came across this painting that John Hall did of James Baldwin, but I wasn't able to afford like an original one because they're thousands of dollars. But I asked him if he does prints, and he at that time didn't, and still doesn't really. But he agreed to. I told him I was a history teacher. Told him I absolutely loved his work, and I asked him if I could buy a print of his James Baldwin one, and when he said yes, I was like, okay, and then why don't you do one of Jimi Hendrix as well? And that's how I got that. So I have two basically original prints, we'll say, that are signed by John Hall, and I think he's an artistic genius, and very proud to display one in my class and then one at my house. So that's where they come from. So okay. A couple of things we need to address right off the bat here. So I have put up new questions for the reading guide, questions 54 through 66. So 12 questions. You have today, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday to get those done. Also, I put up an online vocab matching quiz. Now, I need to just mention to you a couple of things. First of all, with the reading guide questions, what you're going to notice is that we're starting to get in the reading guide a little bit ahead of where we are in the lectures, okay? So as you're reading now, you're going to start reading ahead a little bit of where I'm at in terms of what we're talking about in the live lecture. On the matching, on the vocab matching, there's going the vocab terms. There's going to be terms in the vocab matching assignment that come from last unit. I included some previous stuff that we talked about in the agricultural revolution as terms in this quiz. Also, there will be terms in the online quiz that are from stuff that we haven't yet learned about in the lectures. So just to let you know that you may have to do a little bit of detective work, sleuthing, to find some of the answers. Others of the terms will be more recognizable to you, but I'm the reason I'm doing this is because I think it's good. I want you guys to go through the assignment with the idea of like, do I know what this is or do I not know what this is? And is the reason that I don't know what this is because we haven't talked about it yet, or is it because I wasn't listening and didn't pick it up or didn't learn it right or whatever? Okay, and so just to let you know, I would not wait until the last minute before class on Monday to try to do that vocab matching in like 20 minutes or something. Give yourself an hour and a half to do it. I don't think it'll take any longer than that, but just make sure that you give yourself enough time to do it so that you don't feel rushed and that you have the chance to go through and really ask yourself, like, do I know this word? Do I know how it plays a role in, the French Revolution, et cetera, et cetera? Okay, so those two assignments are available for you. They're both due Monday morning, 8 a.m. Okay, all right. Now, you guys, for last class on Tuesday, you watched this documentary that I assigned to you. There was a little assignment to go along with that. I'm going to take some time to update the grade book today, and which I'm always hesitant to update the grade book too early because missing even one assignment in the early going can really make it seem like you're not doing very well. So I always wait till I have a little bit to put in the grade book so that it gives you a little more accurate reflection. Hey, thanks, Teddy and Jessica. Appreciate that. That documentary is old. It is so old. I've been using it for years and years and years, but it's really good. And they have some really good historians in there. Lynn Hunt was one of the historians in there. I had the opportunity to see her speak when I was in grad school at Fullerton. And she's like world-renowned level historian. She's ridiculous. Much smarter than me. But anyhow, so yeah. Yes, so many heads. So many heads. Lots of people lost their heads in the French Revolution. Yeah, pretty brutal. But good, I'm glad. So now, just to be clear with you guys, that documentary mostly focuses on this phase of the French Revolution that we're going to be talking about in class today, which is the Reign of Terror. So let's just jump right to it. I'm going to switch over to my desktop here, and then we will start talking about what we need to learn today. So put this over here. Do that. Minimize this. Whoops, not maximize, minimize. And pull this up. Okay. There's Maximilien Robespierre. More on him later in class today. But let's start with where we left off, which was on this slide right here. So where we left off was right after the fearsome fish ladies went and did the Women's March to Versailles. And when they go to Versailles, of course, they have the intention of killing the queen. They end up arresting Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette and bringing them back to Paris and having them live at Tuileries Palace, which was in central Paris. And, of course, the National Assembly was also in Paris and intimidated by the Parisians there. The first step towards creating, a more, so what we're talking about right now, we're still in the early phase of the French Revolution. We're not quite to the Reign of Terror yet. So we're in 1790. And this is the second year of the French Revolution. And remember the goal of the revolution in the early years, 1789 through 1792, was to create a constitutional monarchy. They were trying to essentially limit the power of the king, have a quasi-elective process to have a certain segment of the population be able to participate in government. And when I say a certain segment, we need to understand that the reason that, and I've mentioned this to you guys before, but I'll say it again, the reason that constitutional monarchies are not truly democratic is if we look at who gets to participate in it, who gets to hold office, and who gets to have a say in who holds office. It's a very, very, very limited segment of the population. In the early days of democracy, even here in the United States, you have to understand that that for the most part, the only people who were allowed to vote were, number one, men, number two, adult men, number three, adult men who owned land, and then, of course, here in the United States, adult men who were also white, okay? Because clearly no African-American men would have been allowed to participate in government, and if they were, their rights were taken away from them in the early days of the Constitution. So when we talk about early democracy, it's not super democratic because it really does still exclude a whole lot of folks. The mere fact that you don't allow women to vote means that automatically half of your population can't vote, right? Half of your population can't vote. And then beyond that, right, in the early days of the French Revolution, when they're trying to establish this constitutional monarchy, really even of the men that were in Paris, or that were in France rather, only about half of the men were able to vote. So as Evelyn just wrote, three-quarters of the population don't even really get to have a say in anything, and certainly wouldn't have been able to serve in any sort of official government capacity. So we're talking right now about something known as the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. And the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, in effect, secularized religion in France. What do I mean by that? How do you secularize religion? Those two words are kind of like contradictory to one another. So how do you secularize? Basically, they take the religion, the French Catholic Church, the Gallican Church, and they make the church like a government bureaucracy, basically. They subdue the church to the state. And they end up creating a national church with 83 bishops and dioceses for the number of basically departments or counties around France. And in many ways, the Civil Constitution of the Clergy demonstrated early on in the French Revolution that the people who were most revolutionary, the people who favored the most change in France, were a bit out of touch with having a pulse on the general the general will of the rest of the population. Remember that at this time in France, 80% of the population are rural agricultural peasants, right? They're living out in the countryside. They are very conservative. They're very religious. And so when the government, the French Revolutionary government, the National Assembly, passes the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, this is viewed as an attack on the church, which is something that the peasants held very closely to their hearts. They didn't want to see major changes to the system of their faith, right? The structure and system of their faith. So it's kind of a blunder because the revolutionary government starts to lose some of the support of the remainder of the Third Estate in the peasants who, being that they are living on farmlands, they're not educated, they didn't go to college, they don't have law degrees, they don't live in Paris, they're distant, and they have more conservative ideas about the direction that the French Revolution is going. And that's something that I think I need to be very clear with you guys about, which is that we need to understand that the French Revolution, at the heart of it, it is not a peasant-led revolution. The French Revolution is very much a bourgeois-led revolution. It's led by a particular segment of the society who were really educated, who lived in Paris, who even previous to the start of the French Revolution already had, certain. They weren't able to hold governmental positions, and they didn't have the same tax break privileges that nobles had. But many bourgeois members could have been rather wealthy. Some of the bourgeois members of France were even wealthier than some of the nobles were in France. And so they were the ones who had the greatest stake to improve their own position in French society. The bourgeoisie who is serving in the National Assembly, as delegates, making these laws like the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, are going to make laws based on those things that they believe, which are going to be based in the Enlightenment. And so, the French peasantry, not so big on the Enlightenment. They're kind of removed from that. Most of your French peasants are not going to be showing up at salons in Paris with Marie-Therese Geoffrin and Denis Diderot and bumping elbows and talking about political philosophy. The peasants are simple. They live in remote areas. They are religious, and they have a tendency to kind of, not want to see a whole bunch of radical changes. But that's not the direction that the French Revolution is heading. We're heading towards significant radicalism. All clergy, according to the civil constitution of the clergy, all the clergy would be paid by the state and elected by all citizens. Protestants, Jews, and agnostics for the first time could legally take part in the elections so long as they met the citizenship and property qualifications. And the clergy, those people who were considered, priests and bishops and so on in the French Catholic Church, were forced to take a loyalty oath to the new government since the Pope had condemned the revolution. Remember that there's a lot of forces outside of France, the Pope being one of them, because the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church, which is situated in Rome, in Italy, as well as the nobles and monarchs of other countries in Europe, Austria, Prussia, Russia, etc., are not overly excited to see the French Revolution happening because, of course, it's challenging the old European order of society, feudalism, and that kind of first, second, third estate class system that most places in Europe practiced. So the French Revolution is a threat to all of that. It's a challenge to the authority of legitimate monarchs. It's a challenge to the authority of the nobles. And it's a challenge to the church as well, because remember that a lot of people's opinion at this time still rests on the notion that a king's powers are derived from God. And so these conservative forces are going to really try to prevent the French Revolution from being successful. Also, the result of the civil constitution clergy is that it ends up really dividing the former Third Estate, the people of France, over the issue of religion. The Pope, of course, condemns the civil constitution of the clergy as an attempt to subjugate the church to the French state, which it absolutely was trying to do. Half of French priests didn't even accept it. They become known as the refractory clergy, the priests that refuse to take a loyalty oath to the government end up continuing to support the king. They continue to support former aristocrats, peasants, and the urban working class because they're religious and they're more conservative. So the most radical revolutionaries of France, we have to understand, came from the urban area of Paris and largely came from the bourgeois class, right? The upper middle class, the educated class who was really running the revolution. France, after this, became a constitutional monarchy with what was known as a unicameral, or what is known as a unicameral legislative assembly. Unicameral simply means one house, right? So that's different from our government and from Britain's government, which are both considered bicameral legislative assemblies. So Britain, for example, has parliament. That's a two-house legislative assembly. They have the House of Lords, the upper house, and then they have the House of Commons, which is the lower house. And then here in the United States, of course, we have Congress, but Congress is also bicameral. We have the lower house, which is the House of Representatives, and we have the upper house, which is the Senate. And the middle class controlled the government. The bourgeois class controlled the government through an indirect method of voting. Half of all males were eligible to vote. Once again, going back to that notion that even for men in Paris, it was not a guarantee that you would have been able to participate in government via voting. And the nobility is completely abolished. The National Assembly ended up dividing France into those 83 departments. Think of those as counties that would be then governed by elected officials. They also established a new system of law courts, which gave France a unified administrative structure with 83 dioceses, 83 departments, 83 judicial districts. The weakness of this was that, unfortunately, despite their best efforts, the national government really didn't have a whole lot of ability to force local governments in distant areas of France to follow or enforce the laws that were passed at a national level. So think of it like this. It would be like, think of it like if in Washington, D.C., there was a federal law that was passed, and then California, the state of California, was just like, we're not going to follow that law. We're just going to nullify that law. We're not going to enforce it here. The federal government would then be faced with the problem of, like, how do we get California to enforce the laws without sending like the military there or something like that, right? So, and this has happened in America before, by the way. But anyhow, this proved pretty ruinous when war came, because you want your whole nation and all different counties and departments of the nation to follow the national lead, the national directives. And so this proved kind of ruinous when war came, because it made it difficult for France to initially mount a successful defense against an Austrian invasion. There was a lot of economic reforms that start to favor the middle class rather than the lower class. Remember that because it's the bourgeoisie who are making all the decisions, it stands to reason that, of course, they would, be making laws that benefit themselves, which is exactly what they do. This probably sounds a bit corrupt to you, but it's not unpredictable. After all, it happened and still happens, all the way going back in history. But nonetheless, some of the changes that they start to make, the metric system is formally adopted by the government, and that replaced a sloppy system of weights and measures that the French used to use prior to the start of the revolution. They also passed something called the Le Chapelier Law. The Le Chapelier Law was a law that was intended to maintain control over the peasant and working classes. So what the Le Chapelier Law does is it outlaws worker strikes, it outlaws workers' coalitions, so like workers' unions, for example, as well as assemblies, and they prohibit monopolies and things like that. They're also trying to improve internal trade in France. Remember, one of the things that the various estates actually agreed upon when they first met at the Estates General back in May of 1789 was that France had way too many restrictions, regulations, tariffs, taxes, tolls internally, and it made it really difficult to transport goods across France. And so they start to abolish some of these internal tariffs and things. Meanwhile, there's still a lot of problems with the economy in France at this time, and they start using these pieces of paper currency known as assignats. Now, paper currency was not very popular yet at this time anywhere in the world outside of maybe America. The reason being that paper currency was not viewed as having any real value. Paper currency was seen as a placeholder. In the early days, these days, of course, there's, money is what has value. Okay, why does money have value? Because to be honest, there's one word that describes why cash has value. Confidence. Confidence. Why are you willing to take a $20 bill? Let's say I was buying whatever, a book from you, and you're like, the book is $20. Why are you willing to take $20 if I buy a book from you? Because you have confidence that you can then turn right around and use that $20 somewhere else to buy something else, right? You have confidence that the currency has value. Unfortunately, in the early days of paper currency was really used as a placeholder for what people had confidence in at that time, which was not paper money, but gold, silver, and various other precious metals. And so paper money was viewed as a fragile currency that could fluctuate in value, that not everyone had confidence in. And so it took a while for people to kind of embrace using paper money, because ideally you would have rather had what actually people believed had value, which was gold and silver. And the early days of paper money were really just IOUs because of a lack of gold and silver to circulate around the economy to keep it functioning. Remember, it's not easy to get your hands on gold and silver. So, people started using paper currency as a placeholder for gold and silver coins that you would then eventually be able to bring, let's say you had some paper currency, you could go and bring that paper currency to a bank and then exchange it for gold coins or whatever else. okay? But as time goes on, people started to realize, like, if we have the whole economy based on gold and silver, there's never going to be enough gold and silver to circulate around. So let's just adopt paper money as the main function of the economy, and the paper money will be the main form of currency. As you can see, what I mean here about the devaluation of the assignats, the way that how do you give paper money value in this time? The way that they gave paper money value in the French Revolution was that these assignats, the value of them was guaranteed by the value of the church lands that they took control over with the civil constitution of the clergy. So when they passed the civil constitution of the clergy, the government essentially takes ownership of the church lands and then begins to sell those church lands off. And as they sell the church lands off, the money that is acquired from selling off the church lands was used to substantiate the value of the assignats. But over time, that's only like the thing is that the assignats weren't really going to be a permanent solution, because over time they print too many of them, the assignats start to devalue due to inflation, and because there's only so many church lands that they can sell off, and so over time, within just 3 years, you can see here that the value of the assignat has dropped by over half. So now it takes over twice as much assignats to buy the same things that you were able to buy 3 years ago, because of the devaluation of the currency. So the assignats were a temporary solution to try to turn the economy of France around in the short term, but they aren't going to be a successful long-term solution to the money shortage problems, the inflation problems, and the debt problems that France was facing at this time. That said, of course, because France had been in such substantial amounts of debt leading into the French Revolution, a lot of the money that they used from the sale of these church lands, which a lot of it is purchased by peasants, landholding peasants were not very commonplace until they had an opportunity to start purchasing some land. Remember that the reason you didn't see many landholding peasants is because most peasants weren't able to purchase land because the land was already held by nobles, right? The nobles already had the land. They didn't want to give the land away, so there was no land to buy. But after those church lands get absorbed by the state doesn't have any need for all of those lands. They'd rather sell it and get rid of all the debt that they have, and that's what they started to do. One of the most famous stories that you may have heard about in the documentary was the flight to Varennes. The infamous story of when Louis XVI on June 10th of 1791 attempted to escape with his wife, Marie Antoinette, who you'll recall was from Austria and was widely hated by the French people. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette attempted to escape France to Austria so that they could receive protection from the Austrian monarch and hopefully mount a counter-revolutionary force that would ultimately enable the king to retain his revolutionary authority. His governmental authority. And so, the handwriting is on the wall by 1791 for Louis XVI, because he does not want to sign this new constitution that the National Assembly has drafted up. Louis XVI attempts to escape. He makes it to the border of France, a very small town near the border of France and Belgium known as Varennes, and he is He's found out, his identity is discovered in Varennes, and he is taken back to Paris and basically put on house arrest at Tuileries Palace again. And the thing that this did was it really it ended up casting Louis XVI as a traitor to France, and it's the end of his political career, really. There's another term here on this slide that I want to introduce to you called émigré. Émigré. And this is the French term for emigration. Remember, when you emigrate somewhere, you're leaving a nation. When you immigrate somewhere, you're coming into a place. But the émigré was a rather substantial group of nobles who, of course, were threatened and fearful for their lives during the Revolution, who had escaped France and went to seek exile in neighboring countries like, Austria, Prussia, etc. The thing is that in a lot of these places, they're not welcome. Austria is for Austrians. They don't want French noblemen coming over there and taking up space and requiring services and places to live and other things like that. So, frankly, the Prussians and the Austrians are like, we don't want you living here. Get back to France. And you'll see how that plays a role in the French Revolutionary Wars that we're going to be talking about here coming up. But of course, Louis XVI is hoping to gather his forces, if you will, counter-revolutionary forces, the émigré noblemen, foreign military leaders, foreign political leaders, and so on, to put him back on the throne as the absolute monarch of France. But because his escape failed, he gets brought back, and now his career is over. And he's going to be forced to accept this constitutional monarchy. He does not want to sign it into law, of course, because he is literally signing away his absolute authority as King of France. But he has no choice. And so, it's either like sign this or be put on trial for treason. And ultimately, both of those things happen. But anyhow. The next thing we're talking about here is the international reaction to this revolution in France. And this name is one that I really want you to commit to your memories because it's going to come up again in a couple of units. His name is Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke is a British political philosopher. And when the revolutions broke out in France in 1789, the rest of the world is well aware of what's going on because it's absolute turmoil. Most people across Europe did not want to see France have a revolution. They are fearful about what would happen to the rest of Europe, Austria, Prussia, Britain, etc., if the revolution was to spread beyond the borders of France to other places. After all, if the French absolute monarch, who was known to be the greatest absolute monarch in all of Europe, not Louis XVI, but Louis XIV, surely so. If the French monarch can be overthrown, what's to say the Austrian monarch couldn't be overthrown, or the Prussian one, or the Russian one, etc. And they don't want to see that happen. So they have a vested interest in preserving the status quo, defending the tradition of the, of the absolute monarchies across Europe. Even though Edmund Burke comes from Britain, which is a constitutional monarchy, who had already subdued the powers of the king, Edmund Burke is a conservative. And that's the other link that I need you to make, is I need you to make a permanent connection in your head between the name Edmund Burke and the idea of political conservatism. Many times, excuse me, many times, Edmund Burke is kind of given this title of the father of modern political conservatism. I need to take a little bit of time here to discuss with you some ideas surrounding these terms conservative and liberal, okay? So keep an open ear as I talk about this because I'm kind of going to be jumping back and forth in a comparison between these terms, conservative and liberal, used in the context of the 1700s and 1800s compared to how these terms are used today. So hear me out, and if you have questions, of course, you can, you're always welcome to ask questions in the chat. But let me just take a minute here to help clarify these terms for you. At the base of it all, if we boil it down to the most generic way that we can describe these phrases, conservative and liberal, generically, conservative folks tend to want to preserve tradition. They want to defend the status quo, okay? They don't want to see a bunch of changes made, okay? Generically, when we talk conservatism, generically, we're just saying they want to preserve tradition. They want to keep things mostly the same. Generically, when we talk about the term liberal, we are describing a group of people who are trying to initiate changes. They're trying to initiate reforms. They have a tendency to be what we term more progressive, okay? Favoring change. So in both contexts of the 17 and 1800s compared to the 21st century, the terms mean more or less the same thing. However, the thing that separates these terms is what traditions they're defending versus what reforms they're trying to make. So let me describe what I mean. If we're talking about conservatives from the late 17, early 1800s, the tradition that they are trying to preserve is one of, kind of a more medieval, feudal, religious, and also religious structure of European society. European conservatives of the late 17 and early 1800s would be in favor of having legitimate monarchs in power. They would be in favor of a highly, highly regulatory economy, top-down regulated economy, where absolute monarchs are in charge. Mercantilism is used as the economic system where the government has a lot of control over the economy. And they also favor things like a balance of power in Europe so that all European nations more or less live in harmony of absolute monarchies with one another and things like that, okay? When we talk about conservatives of modern times, here in America specifically, okay, here in America specifically, you have to understand that America never really had a strong tradition of, nobles and aristocracy, not in the way that Europe did, at least. There were, of course, large land-owning plantation holders and stuff like that, particularly in the South in America. But the vast majority of American history has been lived in since the Industrial Revolution. And America, from its inception, was always very much embracing of the ideas of Adam Smith capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, as outlined in The Wealth of Nations, which we talked about last semester. But remember that The Wealth of Nations was written in 1776, the same year as the American Revolution broke out. It's a new idea at that time, okay? It's a new idea. And the Industrial Revolution, which happens at the start of the 1800s, also known as the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution ultimately creates if you will, a new tradition, okay? A new tradition. So when we talk about modern day conservatives in the 21st century, typically modern day conservatives have a tendency to try to defend the tenets of free market capitalism. So the tradition that they are defending in modern day times is a tradition that's been around for about 200 years, right? That's the new tradition that they're defending. Free market capitalism, laissez-faire, keep the government out of the economy, deregulate, those kinds of things. They have a tendency to be, and I'm speaking broadly here, obviously, okay? But when we talk about modern day conservatives, they have a tendency to be, number one, more religious. Of course, America was always a very religious country, okay? So their religious views tend to be very important to them, but also they favor big business, you know? They favor free market capitalism, they favor lower taxes, they favor things like this, okay? That's modern day conservatives. However, what makes this somewhat confusing is that if we go back and we look at the other side of liberals, okay? That term liberal is a real confusing one for a lot of folks. If we're talking about liberalism in the late early 1800s, the kinds of policies that the liberals stood for at that time were extremely new, groundbreaking ideas. So the liberals of that time are advocating for change. They're advocating for reform. They're trying to implement ideas from the Enlightenment, which were new. They're trying to implement ideas of free market capitalism, which were new at that time. So classical liberals actually, in many ways, stand for, topically, the same things that modern-day conservatives stand for. Free market capitalism, ideas of the Enlightenment, so on and so forth. The thing is, though, is that time keeps ticking away. And so in the last 200 years, there have been a number of problems that have needed to be addressed, okay? And so now that we're in the 21st century, when we talk about modern-day liberals are still in favor of reform. But instead of reforming to a system of, the Enlightenment and free market capitalism and stuff like that, those ideas now have been around for a couple hundred years. And they have presented problems. For example, during the during the Industrial Revolution, we saw people working 12 to 14-hour days, 6 days a week in miserable factory conditions. We saw the quality of people's life drop. We saw life expectancies drop significantly, where people in some urban areas could only have expected to make it to about 20 years old or so before they die. And so the Industrial Revolution brought with it a number of problems that, as time has gone on, modern-day liberals are now looking to reform, to change. And so in many ways, modern-day liberals actually are looking for more governmental control. They're trying to get laws made that, and again, I'm speaking broadly here, that provide pathways to traditionally oppressed groups of people. Say, for example, in America here, African Americans, we've seen a lot of social strife in America in the last decade, surrounding systemic racism and things like that. And liberals would be looking to pass laws that create a more egalitarian society where economic opportunities are afforded to people who have traditionally not had them offered to them. So modern-day liberals are actually, in some sense, in favor of a bit more governmental control, laws being passed that would limit the ability for the big businesses and corporations and things like that to have undue influence in government and so on. And so these terms, liberal and conservative, can be a bit confusing. I just did the best job that I could in the last 10 minutes or so to try to explain them to you. Of course, if you have further questions, you're welcome to ask me. But hopefully I've given you a pretty even-handed and unbiased explanation of kind of generally what these terms mean and kind of the values that these people stand for, both in an older time during the French Revolution as well as in a more modern context. Okay, so let's just finish up talking about Burke here. In his piece, which was known as the Reflections on the Revolution in France, written at the very start of the French Revolution, it is one of the greatest intellectual defenses of European conservatism from that time. He was defending ideas of inherited privileges of the nobility, particularly those of the English monarchy and aristocracy, because they didn't want to see a widespread bourgeois revolt in England either. And it also predicted that ultimately there would be anarchy and dictatorship in France. And to be honest with you, Edmund Burke was right about this, because we do see a dictatorship established in France under Napoleon, and also to some extent even under Maximilien Robespierre. Not everybody was in agreement with Edmund Burke. One of the most famous counter-arguments posed to Edmund Burke comes from a name that we may have briefly talked about. His name is Thomas Paine. If you haven't heard of him before, you might better know him for a different piece that he wrote called Common Sense, which became the pamphlet widely distributed across the colonies in America at the start of the American Revolution. And Thomas Paine, interestingly, was born in Britain. He moved to America, and he was kind of a perfect example of a student of the Enlightenment. And so when he wrote his piece, Rights of Man, this is yet another piece where he draws upon the teachings of the Enlightenment and responds to Burke's argument by defending Enlightenment principles of liberalism as well as the entire French Revolution. And so in his piece, he said, liberty will always triumph over despotism. That the best way for a society to function is not through absolute monarchs and noble rule, but through freedom of the people. So, with this, of course, kings and nobles across Europe had begun to feel very, very threatened once the revolution started to become more radical, as it's just about to. So let's start talking about this new, what was supposed to be at least, a permanent government in France to establish France as a constitutional monarchy that would have permanently curtailed the political authority of Louis XVI. As I mentioned to you, when the revolution first started, the National Assembly was always meant to be a temporary government. It was never meant to be a permanent solution. They were simply trying to come up with a blueprint for a constitutional monarchy in France, and that blueprint becomes known as the Legislative Assembly. It is officially signed into authority by Louis XVI. Once again, remember, he didn't want to do that. He was forced to. And from the very beginning, the delegates of the National Assembly, who were initially chosen at the start of the Estates General meeting before the revolution began back in May of 1789, the National Assembly had always agreed that when they came up with a more permanent solution to constitutional monarchy in France, that the members of the National Assembly, the delegates, would step down from power and not govern when this new constitution was written, and that there would be a new election and a new government and new representatives. And when they do this, what ends up happening is it actually results in this new government, this legislative assembly elected by, certain segments of the society of France. It ended up reflecting the emergence of the various political factions that had emerged during the start of the French Revolution. Remember, democracy, which is not what this is, but anytime you have multiple people with different opinions on things, it creates conflict. And as a result of that, we see different groups elected to the National Assembly who have differing ideas about the direction that the revolution will continue to go. And the most influential segment of representatives in the Legislative Assembly were from the Jacobin Club. So the Jacobin Club were these radical Republicans, and again, I need you to kind of understand that that phrase, radical Republicans, has nothing to do with what we would term in modern-day America to be a radical Republican. When we say radical Republican here in America, we're talking about people who are part of the American political party called the Republican Party, capital R, okay, Republican Party, who are very extremized in their views, right? So, for example, the riot that happened at the Capitol at the start of the year, was initiated by radical Republicans from America. However, once again, they really have nothing in common with the radical Republicans of the French Revolution. Different groups of people standing for different things, even though we use the same term to describe them. So, what do the radical Republicans in the French Revolution stand for? Well, they are trying to essentially take they try to take France into a more representative style of governance, meaning they're trying to establish France into a republic where they completely do away with the monarch. They completely do away with the noble classes holding power and all of these sorts of things. All right. So that's why they're called Republican or radical Republicans, is because they're literally trying to turn France into a republic, okay, where you would have universal male suffrage, which would, of course, substantially widen the number of people who were able to participate and serve in various capacities in government. And this is a radical idea at that time because France had never tried it before. And, so the people who are most in favor of this came from the Jacobin Club. And they were the ones who dominated the legislative assembly. The Girondins was one segment of the Jacobins, one faction of Jacobins that had ultimately led the country into war. Meanwhile, they still have a number of domestic problems that they're fighting. So France has threats to the revolution, internal threats and external threats to the revolution that this brand new government in the Legislative Assembly is trying to figure out. The thing is that they also have some extremely radical people serving in government who are trying to take this revolution to a whole new level and institute even more changes than have already been put into place. So, war is the main issue that this legislative assembly has to deal with, because France is about ready to be invaded by Austria, and this is first the first time where the legislative assembly starts to feel extremely threatened by foreign invasion is with something known as the Declaration of Pillnitz, which was issued by both Prussia and Austria in August of 1791, just barely after the Legislative Assembly first met. And this was where French émigrés who had left France and were living in Austria and Prussia, these French noblemen living in exile, had influenced both Austria and Prussia to demand a restoration of the French monarchy as their main goal. And in the Declaration of Pillnitz, the Emperor of Austria, the Habsburg ruler of Austria, King Leopold, he threatened to take military steps if the other powers in Europe joined him. Now, to be honest with you, this declaration, the Declaration of Pillnitz, was actually meant to be a bluff. Frankly, Austria and Prussia didn't really want to go to war with France. France had a substantial military, and they were hoping to get the French government in the Legislative Assembly to restore Louis XVI as an absolute monarch without going to war. But this is not how it is perceived by the Legislative Assembly, who is immediately intimidated and threatened by the prospect of an international war with some of the other European powers. So, the declaration was really just a bluff that was intended to slow down the revolution and, frankly, get rid of the émigrés that were living in Austria and Prussia. They wanted to send them back home. Get out of here. We don't want you living here. So, Leopold very much misjudged the revolutionary sentiment that was going on, particularly in Paris at this time, and the radical Republican sentiment that dominated the Legislative Assembly, the government of France. who ended up using the Declaration of Pillnitz as a way of increasing the fervor, the excitement, the hysteria surrounding the prospect of Austria trying to put an end to the French Revolution. So they use this, the Legislative Assembly essentially uses this threat as a way of bolstering their power and influence, particularly in Paris, to continue the revolution. The Legislative Assembly declared war on Austria about 7 or 8 months later, in April of 1792. Very, very much fueled by the ideological fervor and anti-Austrian sentiment that already existed in France even prior to the start of the French Revolution. And the Girondins became, at this time, the party of international revolution. They essentially started to say that the revolution in France could never be secure unless it spread beyond the borders of France into the rest of Europe. Now, this in particular is a very dangerous message to send to the rest of Europe, because it's only going to cause their fears of revolution to continue to widen. And so we see war break out in France in early 1792. And at first, the war does not go very well for France. The Austrians come in there, and due to the inability of the Legislative Assembly, who had, remember, lost a lot of support from the peasant population, who comprised about 80% of the population of France in distant regions outside of Paris, it made it difficult for them to mount an effective defense in the early days. And Austria comes in there and basically starts really, handing defeat after defeat to the French military. The French revolutionary forces are soundly defeated by the Austrian military in the early days, and it was really only we've talked about this before, but I want to remind you that at this same time, there is some competition going on between the Eastern European nations of Austria, Prussia, and Russia over the partitions of Poland. And the partitions of Poland really saved the French Revolution unusually. So as Poland loses their entire kingdom to these three different nations, Russia, Austria, Prussia, it was enough of a distraction from the war against France to allow the French revolutionary forces to rebound and start fighting more effectively in their defense of the revolution. So this also ended up intensifying the existing unrest and dissatisfaction of the unpropertied classes living in and around Paris at this time, to bring the revolution to a whole new level. The Jacobins you might think that the people of France would quickly point to the Jacobin Club to blame them for this pathetic initial defense that they put up against Austria, where they were so badly defeated in the early days of the War of the First Coalition. But the Jacobins turn right around and point the finger at Louis XVI, and they say, well, if it wasn't for Louis XVI conspiring with Prussia, Austria, and the émigrés, the nobles living in exile outside of France, we wouldn't have this problem. And so they were very quick to use Louis XVI and the nobles and so on as a scapegoat for why they were defeated so badly early on. Shortly thereafter, in July of 1792, comes another threat from Austria and Prussia, this one known as the Brunswick Manifesto, because it was officially written up by a guy named the Duke of Brunswick, who I believe was Prussian. And this manifesto basically was an ultimatum. It basically said, if you harm one hair on the heads of the royal family, we will completely level Paris. This threat was not taken well by the people of Paris, nor by the government in power in Paris, the Legislative Assembly. And in response to the Brunswick Manifesto, Jacobin mobs started seizing Paris, taking over the entire city. Revolutionary sentiment at this time was stoked by three major figures of the Reign of Terror phase of the French Revolution. These guys were Maximilien Robespierre on the left, Georges Danton in the middle, and Jean-Paul Marat on the left, or on the far right. And these three guys kind of, Maximilien Robespierre and Georges Danton were good friends with one another. They served in the most radical segment of the French Revolution, which was known as the Mountain. And the Mountain were even more radical than the Girondists were. And so these guys who make up the leaders of the Mountain, which was the largest segment of the Legislative Assembly, end up fueling this discontent and stoking the flames of the revolution to grow larger. Jean-Paul Marat, we talked about last week. Jean-Paul Marat was this guy who you probably saw in the documentary, was this professional malcontent who made a name for himself in the French Revolution with this paper that he published called The People's Friend, which publicly admonished, called out people in and around Paris for not being in favor of the revolution, for being anti-revolutionary. And in many cases, it did not take much to be called out by Jean-Paul Marat in his paper, The People's Friend, which again is kind of a misleading name, because if your name was mentioned in The People's Friend, you were anything but a friend of the people, because you were likely to be tried and executed by way of guillotine. So Jean-Paul Marat was one of these other people, again, stoking the flames of the revolution. On August 10th, Tuileries, the palace that the king had been kept in, well, the whole royal family had been kept in house arrest on after being captured from the flight to Varennes, the Tuileries palace gets stormed by angry mobs of Jacobins. And the king is taken prisoner and thrown into the dungeon after trying to flee to the Legislative Assembly. Many of the Swiss guards, which were these mercenary military dudes who were protecting the royal family, many of them are defeated and murdered by this Parisian mob. And when we say Parisian, we just mean people of Paris. And this marked the beginning of what we will call, if you will, the Second Revolution of France, the more violent, radical revolution of France. And here's a painting of the storming of Tuileries Palace. During this new phase, in August of 1792, the Paris Commune comes to power. Because the revolutionary fervor in Paris, the capital of France, had been largely led by the Jacobins, who at the top of the Jacobin party were, or the Jacobin club, were Georges Danton and Maximilien Robespierre. They end up setting up a revolutionary municipal, which just means city government, in Paris that usurped the power of the Legislative Assembly. So the Paris Commune essentially takes over the government. They usurp the power, and the Legislative Assembly no longer has the ability to control the affairs of the government. The Legislative Assembly was obliged, obliged the radicals, the guys like Danton and Robespierre and the rest of the Jacobin Club and the Mountain, by suspending the 1791 Constitution. So within 1 year, the Legislative Assembly has already essentially been dissolved. And they ordered the Mountain, the Paris Commune, under the leadership of Danton and Robespierre, ordered new elections to take place that would be based on universal male suffrage, so widening the number of people who are able to participate in voting, for the creation of a new form of government in a republic. And that is what they do. The next month, in the initial weeks of September, the Paris Commune, the municipal city of government that had dissolved the Legislative Assembly, led these September massacres after rumors started spreading around Paris that a bunch of these counter-revolutionary nobles that had been imprisoned in various jails across Paris, as well as various former First Estate priests, clergy members, that these counter-revolutionary forces were trying to plot an overthrow of the revolutionary government with foreign leaders. And these rumors spread very quickly across France, stoking a whole lot of discontent. So, Prussia, meanwhile, had already invaded eastern France, which further increased the hysteria, and mobs of Jacobins, radical revolutionaries in Paris, began storming these prisons and slaughtering these imprisoned aristocrats and priests, who, frankly, from their position in prison, likely would not have been able to coordinate any sort of organized revolt. But that didn't matter because people were under the belief that they could, and they didn't want to see France return back to an absolute monarchy, and they also don't want to see France taken over by Prussia and Austria. So, the September massacres result in the deaths of a lot of people, and we are now formally in what we will call the Reign of Terror. The Age of Rousseau, remember, is the nickname that we're giving it in our class. I would tell you, don't use these phrases like the Age of Montesquieu, Age of Rousseau on the AP exam, because your grader may not know what you're talking about. I'm simply using them to broadly categorize the different phases of the French Revolution, and we are now in a new one, the Republican phase, the most radical phase of the French Revolution. So, the Age of Rousseau is when this new government comes to power. The new government, after these elections with universal male suffrage, would be called the National Convention. 1792 to 1795 is how long it lasted. This became the most radical phase of the French Revolution under the leadership of Maximilien Robespierre and his good buddy, Georges Danton. So France proclaimed themselves to be a republic on September 21st, 1792. The monarchy at this point was completely abolished. There would no longer be a king of France at all. There is no longer a monarchy at all. And they based their ideas, of course, firmly on the teachings of the Enlightenment, which advocated for republican government, which had already been established successfully, or at least relatively successfully, in America. Most members of this new national convention, the new government that took power in France at this time, were Jacobins. And they were largely well-educated middle-class bourgeois folks. The two major factions of the Jacobin Club were the Mountain, the most radical revolutionaries, which were made up of both radical Republicans from the bourgeois class, as well as many of the urban working class that lived in and around Paris. Leaders Robespierre and Danton sat on the upper left of the assembly hall that the National Convention convened in. And that's why they got nicknamed the Mountain, is because they sat all the way at the top and all the way over to the left of this assembly hall, designating their positions as the most radical of the French revolutionaries. Meanwhile, the Girondins tended to be, even though they were still part of the Jacobin Club, they tended to be more moderate and largely rural, trying to keep a pulse, or at least a better pulse, on the sentiments of the peasants who comprised 80% of the population of the rest of France outside of Paris. Meanwhile, you also had this group of urban revolutionaries living in Paris known as the sans-culottes. They were very, very much in agreement with the principles of the Mountain. They were very radical revolutionaries, and the sans-culottes, we've talked about them without you really even knowing about it. They were predominantly working class folks, urban workers. They were extremely radical, and their violence and influence kept the revolution moving forward. If we talk about some of the things that the sans-culottes were responsible for, go all the way back to the storming of the Bastille, sans-culottes. The Women's March to Versailles, those women were considered part of the sans-culottes. The storming of Tuileries Palace, where they took and imprisoned the king, sans-culottes. The September massacres, where they raided the prisons and killed all the nobles and clergymen, sans-culottes. Why do they call themselves the sans-culottes? Because culottes were essentially fancy pants. When we say sans, that's a phrase meaning without. So they call themselves without fancy pants, okay? The reason they called themselves that is because they prided themselves on the fact that they were working class revolutionaries, everyday common folk, if you will. And they rejected the tyranny of the noble class. And so these guys were proud that they didn't wear fancy noble clothing. Here you can see a classical image of what the sans-culotte typically dressed like. It's not dissimilar to the way that the American revolutionaries dressed, except for they do have this little emblem on their hat, which is known as a cockade. And this cockade was a symbol that you were both part of the French Revolution as well as in favor of the Mountain, the Jacobin Club. So you were a pro-revolutionary sans-culotte member. And women, of course, played a very significant role as well. And you can see the similar style of dress that the women wore. Here, you can see various members of the sans-culotte dancing around what was known as the Liberty Tree, in a dance that was known as La Carmagnole. And on the right is the captured Bastille, symbolizing the virtue of the revolution, as well as a fleeing Austrian army on the left over here. You can see the Austrian army retreating over here. And so the patriotic ardor, they're dancing around this Liberty Tree. You can see a bunch of cockades, symbol of the revolution on there, as well as this thing. This is a Phrygian bonnet, which was a very common headpiece, hat, to wear if you were part of the sans-culotte. Here's a closer image of kind of what it looked like. This image here says indivisible unity of the republic, freedom, equality, brotherhood, or death. Okay, that's what this says in French there. Here's a artist representation of Marianne, who was a symbol, a French symbol of liberty and democracy adopted during the French Revolution, which also appeared several times throughout the 18th century. So the Revolutionary Army finally turns things around in the fall of 1792. And in February of 1793, the National Convention widened the war by declaring war on Britain, Holland, also known as the Dutch Republic, as well as Spain, in addition to the wars they were already waging against Austria and Prussia. And that's why it's called the War of the First Coalition, is because it's a coalition of nations who are fighting against France to try to put an end to the revolution and restore Louis XVI as monarch. However, they were going to have a real hard time doing that by 1793, because in January of 1793, Louis XVI was tried and convicted of treason and executed by way of guillotine in January. In fact, let me double check here. We're really close to the anniversary of it. Louis XVI. I didn't recognize this until just now. We may have just passed it. My internet is going very slowly. Oh, wait, here we go. Holy smokes, I can't even believe it. Look at this, guys. This is the first time this has ever happened in this class. He was executed on this, I thought that was today. He was executed on this day, January 21st. Of 1793 is the day that Louis XVI was executed. We're literally on the anniversary of Louis XVI's execution today. How cool is that? Wow. I love when that happens in history. Okay, so on this cold winter day in France, back in 1793, Louis XVI is tried and convicted and executed by the state. And Marie Antoinette had her days were numbered after this as well. And here you can see Louis XVI's head literally being, as was commonplace in these times, they would hold the head up to demonstrate that it had been completely severed from the body, and there they are holding up Louis XVI's head to a crowd of Parisian sans-culotte folks, military, and so on. Is my time up with you guys right now? Am I supposed to be done with class at this point? Okay, so what we'll do is we'll call an end to it right here, I guess. I'm about four slides behind. Okay, I'm 4 slides behind where I got to in first period today, but we'll be able to cover those pretty quickly at the start of next class, so I'm not too concerned about that. So, with that, folks, I just want to say thanks so much for tuning in and listening to me yammer on for an hour and a half about the French Revolution. I hope that today's lecture was informative for you. And we will pick it up on Monday morning. Don't forget to do the new questions as well as the vocab matching quiz over the weekend, folks. And I want you to have a wonderful rest of your day, a great Friday, and we'll see you back Monday morning.